So the prompt for us was to think about both the challenges and in a sense, I think if we are thinking about the challenges, then the challenges are not just about the field work that we carry out or the context that we engage with, but also our disciplinary positions. So I'm coming at some of these questions as a political theorist. And one of the advantages / disadvantages of political theory is that one is interested in both kind of defining and thinking about the implications of calling things a particular name. In general, my research is concerned with moving beyond Eurocentrism, but then moving beyond to really think with ideas that are different, that make us uncomfortable. Right? So often when we talk about moving beyond Eurocentrism, we are interested in overlaps. We think about and we engage with ideas that seem similar to us, that might be ideas that we can adopt more easily. And I've been really interested in the course of my research generally to engage with ideas that are different, that force us to rethink some of our own, deeply held normative and conceptual beliefs. So let me start with giving you a very quick overview of the project that I'm going to base my comments on. And so when Monica yesterday suggested the importance of emotions, I realized I was thinking about the fact that all my projects have been started in anger. And so it is anger that animates the beginning. And I hope that, some of that then also gives way to wisdom, not an emotion, but a state of being. But this project was about the so-called tribal refugees from parts of Pakistan that are next to Afghanistan. And from the early 2000s, when the war in Afghanistan started, when one of the most powerful military mights, the US and the NATO alliance, attacked one of the poorest countries in the world, Afghanistan, the war spilled out also in Pakistan. And people in the tribal areas were those who were also directly implicated, directly affected. But this was not recognized by either the Pakistani or the American government for several years. So for many years, for instance, drone attacks were carried out on these people. And both governments actually refused. They said, no, there's no drone attacks. Nothing's happening here. We know, and drone attacks were sold to audiences here by saying that these are particularly precision strikes, right? There's less collateral damage with drone attacks. And we know that is not the case. So the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, for instance, carried out research trying to name the dead. And so from their latest figures, we have an estimate of 2,379 people killed by US drone strikes in Pakistan. And of those, only 704 can be named. Of the ones that can be named, only 255 are alleged militants, right? So the idea that drones are precision instruments and that these populations were not impacted by this war is clearly a false idea. But I want to really start with two recent debates in South Asia to think about the question of racism more broadly. A refrain that I heard from many of the people that I interviewed, especially the younger tribal people who had refugees and migrants from the tribal areas who were now in the bigger cities of Pakistan, was something like this. They would say, we are the blacks of Pakistan. If there are raids on hostels to check for drugs and weapons, tribal boys are picked up first. If there is any violence in the city, all tribal men are open game for the police to label as terrorists. The specific interview that I'm quoting from was conducted before the death of Naqibullah Mahsood, which became a source of widespread political mobilization. Mahsood was an aspiring 27-year-old model who was picked up by the police and then shot in a staged encounter and labeled as an Islamist militant. This and other instances of marginalization and state violence led to a movement by young Pashtuns who spoke about the racialization of tribals. Now, a second debate that I also want to just quickly mention. In April 2009, Dalit activists in India attempted to have casteism classified as racism at the World Conference in Durban, the World Conference on Racism in Durban. The Indian government successfully defended itself against this by saying that caste is not race, caste is particular to India, it is not something that can be easily translated as race, and there's no biological basis to it, there's no phenotypical question around it. And so the Indian government was able to establish that caste and race are separate things. Okay, but what is going on here? Why are these two very different groups, the Pashtuns from the tribal areas, Dalit groups in India, why are they wanting the marginalization that they are facing to be recognized as racism? What does it mean for these very different groups to claim that they are suffering racism? Especially in the case of the Pashtuns, when their physical phenotypical features are those that are actually really appreciated in South Asia because they are the same as Europeans to the extent that they are lighter skinned, they have light eyes, light hair. And so the Pashtuns are not claiming racialization as something that is to do with their skin color. So what is happening here? One answer is that this is a political strategy to make intelligible their plight in a language that is much more accessible to a global audience. That is to say, claiming that they are at the receiving end of racism allows immediate legibility to their claims to an international audience. And so this is something that in the case of Dalits, commentators like Nivedita Menon have recognized. So I'm quoting her, she says, "The translation of caste, enabling it to be read against race, is a creative political strategy." End of quote. Now, I think that she's correct in some ways, but then do we take this equation? What she's also saying is that race is not caste, and yet casteism is racism. So what is it that allows casteism to be read as and alongside racism? I'm going to also, because I think in those terms, I'm going to also provide you with some historical variations in South Asia, because I'm also particularly interested in how race and slavery become entwined in our conceptualization when we think primarily with frameworks that have been developed in North America to do with transatlantic slavery. And I'm thinking of Mara's invitation to go beyond Eurocentric frameworks, to go beyond the transatlantic framework. Now, we know that slavery is one of the oldest institutions in human history, from the close relationship between slavery and the Athenian democracy to Native Americans. Pre-colonial Native Americans also had a trade in slaves. We know that there is an acceptance of slavery in Islamicate context, right? And in Islam, there is no prohibition of slavery. There are long-standing historical relationships between Africa and India of slave trade. So we know that slavery has existed for a long time, but in fact that slavery was not linked to racism, right? And in the South Asian context, one of the things that is very important and very interesting for us to note is that slavery was not always linked to racism, and racism was not always linked to slavery. So we need to kind of also make these distinctions. So in the South Asian context, for instance, some very famous cases are of these slaves who were imported during the Mughal regime, but by the Deccan kingdoms, imported from Africa to lead armies for the Deccan kingdoms, who became kings in their own rights and princes in their own rights. And these were elite slaves who actually often had much more power than the same kind of racial group, but a peasant or a working class as the king. So there is a much more complicated history, and the reason why I bring that complicated history to our thinking today is that because of that complicated history, because of the variation in history, there will also be different kinds of solutions and different ways in which racism will play out in different contexts, right? So I focus on the difference, but there is also something that is similar. And so if we keep, just sorry, quickly, before we move to the similarity, I think when we think with this difference, one of the things that becomes available to us is also to think about other ways of thinking about freedom and equality, right? So the solutions will be different as well. If we think with those different histories, those different conceptual repertoires, then different kinds of solutions might also become possible to us. What is similar? And why are these different kind of narratives of marginalization presented to us as racism? I think what is similar is that racism can be thought of as a mode of governance that has become universal today with the democratic state, right? There is a certain way in which racism is a mode of governance. This is different from saying that modern states are founded on racist principles and that the founders were often racist, such as in the case of America. That is true. But to stop there is to succumb to the liberal fantasy that changing the leaders, getting anti-racist leaders will transform these states. That will not happen. There is also, and what I'm saying is also different from saying that capitalism and racism develop together and are deeply interwoven, as racial capitalism theorists such as Eric Williams and Cedric Robinson have argued. They're right, I'm not disputing that. But I think they are also not recognizing that it doesn't stop and that there are different histories of how racism and capitalism came together in different parts of the world. So what I suggest is that racism is a mode of, when I suggest that racism is a mode of governance, I mean that contemporary liberal democratic governance requires systematic categorization and aggressive marginalization as a necessary feature of governance. That particular populations targeted might vary over time. They can be Palestinian, they can be Pashtun, they can be Sindhis, they can be Dalit, and they may not be. They may be other groups at different times. But the process is what I am talking about here. The particular population targeted might vary over time, but the mechanics are often similar. The construction of a discourse of inherent propensity towards violence, but also brilliance, etc., that may not necessarily depend upon phenotypical features. It can include cultural and civilizational reasoning, as in the case of Islamophobia. The generation of studies and scientific knowledge, which is a feature of modern racism, right? So how race was imagined in 16th century Britain and 16th century India is very different from modern racism, which is very implicated, very much kind of expanded and explained through scientific theories of racial hierarchies. And we know that those scientific theories of racial hierarchies continue even today, even as anti-racist scientists are carrying out research that still kind of is based on racial differences as the basis for that research. And of course, the discourses and uses of means of surveillance and violence to manage such populations. So caste is not a race, but lower caste persons face racism, right? Caste doesn't have to be the same as race, and yet they can face racism. Palestinians and Pashtuns are not a race, yet they face racism. So these things can also be separated for us. So racism, I think, is a global mode of governance. The variegated histories in different parts of the world mean that there is variation in how this global mode of governance is practiced and how importantly it can be and has been resisted. I want to end by emphasizing that once we think with those marginalized and at the receiving end of racism, we will also have slightly different solutions. And so, for instance, with the tribal people that I engaged with and I interviewed, many of them actually foregrounded a concept that I've written about elsewhere, which is non-statist vision of justice. They rely on the concept of haq. Some colleagues and friends have translated haq as a vernacular discourse of human rights, and I disagree. I don't think that this is a vernacular discourse of human rights. Human rights also ultimately have to be imposed by states. Haq is much more complicated. Haq is a relationship that is dependent both on obligation and entitlement. Haq is not a translation of right, as many in South Asia or working with Arab and Islamic languages have done. Haq is a complicated concept linked to the idea of truth, but to bind people in relationships of mutual obligation and reliance. Let me just note here that Haq Haq brings a concept of justice that is a set of practices and ideas that structure the provision of justice by foregrounding social relationships rather than the state enforcement, and a deep entwining of obligations and entitlements held simultaneously by collectives and individuals, or linked directly to the assertion of truth. Engaging seriously with Haq, its differences from state-enforced rights, allows us to expand the conceptual repertoire available for understanding the dynamics of justice that foreground societal engagement, and move away from something that we have all, and progressive movements more generally, have been engaged with for a very long time, which is the provision of state-based rights. Right? This is, Haq really moves attention away to how to build those social mutual obligations that will support and move us beyond these modes of governance that I'm calling racism. Thank you very much.